her apartment door. It was 2 a.m., which is either late or early depending on how you look at it. She was returning after popping out to get some cigarettes from the local store, just like she had done many nights before. But this night wouldn't end like all the others. As she pushed her key into the lock, Ashley felt the cold brush of a gun at her side. Then she heard a voice, "If you do what I say, I won't kill you." She was terrified, but with no other choice, she allowed herself to be led into her apartment by the gunman. Once inside, he took her into the bathroom, tied an electrical cord around her wrist, and covered her face with a hand towel. Ashley knew this was it. There was no doubt in her mind that the man was going to kill her. She thought of her 5-year-old daughter, of how she would never see her smiling face again. For once, she was grateful that her daughter lived with Ashley's aunt. You see, Ashley had struggled with drugs since high school, and she was in the process of trying to piece her life back together. A few years before the gunman had tied her up in her own bathroom, Ashley held her husband as he died in her arms after he was stabbed during a brawl. Since then, her substance abuse had spiraled so much that during a meth-induced psychosis, she let go of her steering wheel while she was driving and crashed. She had escaped death then, but she was sure that this time there was no avoiding her own demise. Just as she waited for the sound of the gun to clock and fire, she heard the strangest thing. The shower turned on. Of all things, the man that was there to kill her was taking a shower. She waited in stunned silence until she heard the shower turn off. Then the man removed the dish towel from her head, and Ashley came face to face with her captor. She didn't know it then, but the man was 33-year-old Brian Gene Nichols, and just hours earlier, he had escaped from custody. Brian Nichols was born on the 10th of December 1971 into a middle-class family. He went to Cardinal Gibbons High School in Baltimore, Maryland, before enrolling in Courthouse University of Pennsylvania in 1989. Standing at a formidable 6'1" and weighing 210 pounds, it's no surprise that Brian joined the football team as a linebacker whilst in college. Those who knew Brian during this time remember him as the kind of person not to be messed with. Not only was the guy big, but he was also proficient in martial arts. His reputation as an agitator was only furthered by his affinity for getting in trouble with the law. In 1990, Brian was charged with disorderly conduct, harassment, and terroristic threats. The following year, he was again charged with disorderly conduct, misdemeanor criminal mischief, and criminal trespassing. With those charges threatening to end his college football career, he left Kutztown University and enrolled at Newbury College. He promptly signed up for the football team and promised his coaches that he was there for a fresh start and would put the trouble of his past behind him. But his desire to turn over a new leaf didn't stick, and Brian couldn't keep himself out of trouble. When he was caught stealing, he was booted off the football team, and his football dream came crashing down for good. After that, Brian decided he'd had enough of college and dropped out completely. He relocated to Georgia, where he took a job with Hewlett-Packard as a Unix system engineer. It was only then that Brian seemed to settle down. He was earning good money and he regularly attended the local church. Life was good for Brian, and despite his checkered history and the frequent brushes with the police, he seemed to have found his stride. But in 2004, everything changed. It's alleged that Brian learned his ex-girlfriend had begun a relationship with a church minister. The relationship between Brian and his ex-girlfriend had ended years earlier, but Brian could not let it go. In a fit of jealous rage, Brian broke into his ex-girlfriend's apartment, bound her with duct tape and stabbed her at gunpoint. She survived the assault and was able to name Brian as her attacker. He was arrested and charged, and a date was set for his trial. But locking Brian away was not going to be so easy. Brian's first trial went off without a hitch until the time came for the jury to deliberate on his guilt or innocence. The jury could not reach a consensus, and a mistrial was declared. Despite the setback, the prosecution announced that they were determined to bring Brian to justice and that they will be pursuing a retrial. After hearing this news, Brian was heard saying, "I'm not going to go lying down." When the second trial began, it was clear that Brian thought he could sway the jurors again. He began to taunt the prosecutors about how they were doing a bit better during the second trial than they had during the first. But the bravado was simply a shield Brian used to cover his fear. Deep down, he knew that this time he would not get away with what he had done, and it was almost guaranteed that he would be spending some time in jail. But the cold reality of the situation didn't cause Brian to adjust his behavior. Instead, he made a promise. He told everyone that he would not go down without a fight. At the time, people might have thought his words were just the desperate rants of a man who would finally be held accountable. But before long, they all came to realize that they were more than just empty threats. They were a solemn oath. In the days leading up to the end of the second trial, multiple people reported that they were concerned that Brian was planning something. First, one of Brian's friends told the DA's office that he thought Brian was planning an escape. The friend claimed that Brian asked him to slip him a credit card. Then Brian's own mother contacted the Fulton County Sheriff's Office to tell them her son was planning to steal an officer's weapon. The final clue that something was not right with Brian came just 2 days before his escape. By then, he was a desperate man, and desperate men often make violent decisions. Sure enough, while being moved from the courthouse back to his cell, officers found what looked like 2 door hinges concealed in his shoes. They feared he would turn these hinges into shanks, a common and deadly weapon used in prison. After this incident, the judge presiding over the second trial, Judge Barnes, decided to have additional security present in the courthouse during Brian's testimony. Perhaps they feared that if he was going to try and pull something, he would do it then. That brings us to the morning of the 11th of March 2005. The bus that transported Brian from the jailhouse to the courthouse arrived bright and early, just like it did every morning. Brian hopped off the bus and saw the guard that would be transporting him to the holding cell on the 8th floor of the courthouse. It was the same guard who had transported Brian on numerous other occasions. Her name was Cynthia Hall. Cynthia was 51 years old and stood at just 5'1" tall, a whole foot shorter than Brian. You might think that she would have been intimidated by the large man, but on the contrary, she trusted Brian not to try anything. Her trust ran so deep that when her colleague suggested that Cynthia ask for backup while transporting Brian, she replied, "No, I've got him." In her mind, she had managed by herself many times before, so why would that day be any different? She even decided not to put leg shackles on him as she moved him between the bus and the 8th floor. Cynthia would soon learn that trusting this accused would have deadly consequences, and not just for her. When Cynthia and Brian got to the holding cell, she uncuffed him so that he could change out of his prison clothes and into his trial suit. But as she went to uncuff his second hand, she was suddenly struck in the face. She flew off her feet and crashed onto the floor. She was struck so hard that when she received medical attention for her injuries, doctors thought she had been shot. She was put into a medical coma. The brain damage from the punch still plagues her to this day. All of this from one punch. That is the degree of force that Brian held in his fist. When Cynthia was incapacitated, Brian stole her Beretta .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol and locked her in his cell. He then moved to another cell, changed into the suit, and left the holding area. Now you might be thinking, surely someone would be watching the CCTV footage and would be on their way to help Cynthia and to stop the violent escapee. But you would be wrong. No one was watching, and no one knew that there was a dangerous man on the loose. Once Brian was out of the holding area, he didn't make a run for freedom like you might expect. Brian was driven by vengeance, and instead of heading down the stairs which would lead him to the outside world, he ran straight for his target, the judge. On his way to the judge's chambers, Brian ran into two case managers and an attorney. He pointed the gun at them and demanded to know where Judge Barnes was. But as he waited to find out, a bailiff walked into the chambers. He tried to wrestle the gun away from Brian, but was quickly overpowered by the larger man. Brian took the bailiff's weapon and made the bailiff handcuff the other hostages. He did as he was told, but he knew he was the only one who could do something to possibly stop Brian, even though he didn't have a weapon. So when Brian wasn't looking, the bailiff pressed the emergency button, which would tell the other officers that they were needed at his location. But those officers responded to the alarm verbally through the radio to confirm what support was needed. This meant that Brian was now aware that backup was on its way. He grabbed the radio from the bailiff and attempted to convince the other officers that it was a false alarm. Luckily, the deputies knew the bailiff's voice and realized the person on the line was not their colleague. By now, Brian knew he had to act quickly. He locked the bailiff in the bathroom and entered courtroom 8F, the very place where his trial was set to continue that day. In the courtroom, he finally found the person he had been looking for all along, Judge Barnes. He pointed the gun at the judge's head and pulled the trigger, killing him instantly. He then turned the gun at Julia Brando, a court reporter who was also in the courtroom that day. His shot killed her instantly. Then he looked around the courtroom to spot his other targets, his ex-girlfriend and the prosecution team. Fortunately, no one else had arrived to the courtroom yet, so Brian ran for the emergency stairwell. Sergeant Hoyt Teasley had just arrived on shift that morning when he heard the courthouse alarm ring. Without a radio or a bulletproof vest, he ran to fulfill his duty to protect and serve. That's when Brian came barreling down the staircase. The officer had no way of knowing that Brian had already killed two people just moments earlier. He was now not only an accused rapist, he was also a murderer. Sergeant Hoyt Teasley had just arrived on shift that morning when he heard the courthouse alarm ring. Without a radio or a bulletproof vest, he ran to fulfill his duty to protect and serve. That's when Brian came barreling down the staircase. The officer had no way of knowing that Brian had already killed two people just moments earlier. He was now not only an accused rapist, he was also a murderer. Sergeant Teasley was hot on his tail and followed him down 7 flights of stairs until Brian reached the outside door. As he burst through the door, he kept firing shots in the air, but it didn't deter the officer. Brian knew he wouldn't get away without a fight, so he turned around and took aim. He fired 2 shots at the officer. Sergeant Teasley became Brian's 3rd murder victim right there on the fire escape stairs. Once Brian left the courthouse, he stole a vehicle and sped away from the scene. When he was only a few blocks away, he drove into a car park and used his vehicle to block the entrance. He then stole another car at gunpoint before heading to another car park, where he attempted to steal yet another car. This time, he tried to take the driver of the car as a hostage, but she managed to get away. After that, he approached another driver and told the man to get into his own trunk. Once again, the driver fought him off, which prompted Brian to smash him in the head with a pistol. Then he stole the man's car and drove away. At this point in the story, it might be difficult to understand the erratic nature of Brian's getaway. Maybe he wanted to create as much chaos as possible, and that's why he stole so many cars and harmed so many people. The more likely explanation is that he was a man in a full-blown panic, and his mind was as chaotic as his actions. After failing to take a hostage, Brian headed to the train station, where he boarded a train heading north. At some point, he made it to Buckhead, which is a popular neighborhood in Atlanta. In Buckhead, he attempted to break into a woman's apartment and hold her hostage. But when he entered the woman's apartment, he was confronted by the woman's boyfriend. The boyfriend and Brian wrestled for a bit while the woman called 911. When Brian realized the police were on their way, he hit the boyfriend in the head with a gun and took off. It's clear that Brian was a madman without direction and nothing to lose except his newfound freedom. His initial motive was revenge on the judge and his ex-girlfriend, but it seems like he hadn't thought much further than that. This is what made him infinitely more dangerous. Officials knew that Brian was deadly and would stop at nothing to maintain his freedom, so they offered a $65,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. At some point during his escape, Brian encountered U.S. Immigration and Custom Enforcement agent David Wilhelm. There's no clear account of what happened between the two men, but the next day, Agent Wilhelm was found shot to death inside his own home. Whoever shot him stole his gun, his cash, and his pickup truck. All of that brings us to 2 a.m. on the 12th of March when Brian spotted Ashley walking into her apartment building. She had no idea who Brian was or what he had done, but she was intelligent enough to realize that he was deadly. When he began to shower, Ashley decided that if she had any hope of survival, she had to make this man see her as human and not as yet another bump in his way. So she started to talk. She told him about her daughter and why she didn't live with her anymore. For hours, the pair chatted about their life struggles. Ashley told Brian about her battle with substance and how she was trying to find her way back to God. At some point, Brian asked if she had any drugs in the house, and Ashley gave him some meth, but she refused to take any herself. Eventually, Ashley asked Brian if she could read him a book. The book was A Purpose-Driven Life, written by Pastor Rick Warren. They started talking about purpose, and Ashley asked Brian what he thought her purpose in life was. Brian said, "I think you need to share your story with people to help other people." Then he asked her what she thought he should do about the situation he was currently in. Ashley told him he needed to turn himself in. She encouraged him by saying that everyone makes mistakes and that he needed to face the consequences of his choices. On the morning of the 13th of March, Brian asked Ashley if she could drive behind him while he drove the pickup truck he had stolen from the ICE agent to another location. By then, it had been more than 7 hours since Brian forced his way into Ashley's apartment. Brian told Ashley that he would drop the car off and then they would drive back to her house together. Ashley agreed to his plan and they set off together. When they returned to Ashley's apartment, she made them both pancakes for breakfast. When the energy had settled, she asked him a question. Would he be willing to let her go and see her daughter? To her surprise, Brian agreed and even gave her some money in case she needed it. Ashley wasn't about to waste her one chance for freedom. She immediately left the apartment, got into her car and drove off. While she was driving, she called 911 and let them know where they could find Brian. Minutes later, armed police arrived at Ashley's house. Instead of the confrontation they were expecting, Brian simply waved a white towel as a symbol of his surrender, and he was arrested without incident. By then, it had been more than 26 hours since he had escaped from custody. Brian was charged with 54 crimes, including 4 counts of murder. On the 7th of November 2008, Brian was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison.
None of this will be served on probation. I'm not planning on giving Mr. Nichols any probation at all. Neither am I planning on giving him a fine. Even though you may not like Mr. Nichols, let's give a fair trial to everybody. Let's let them continue to be innocent until proven guilty. Let's give everybody a jury trial if they wanted it. That's what Mr. Nichols wanted. That's what he got. And let's treat them perhaps better than they treated everybody else. I don't want to make it personal, but at the same time, if I can save a life, do not trust me. Ever